3 seasons, 79 episodes, a budget that made network accountants nervous. And somehow, out of all that, came one of the most influential pieces of television ever produced. Star Trek premiered on NBC in September 1966, created by Gene Roddenberry, and starred William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as the half-Vulcan Mr. Spock, and DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. It was canceled after its 3rd season. Ratings were never great, and almost nobody at the network thought it would matter in 10 years. They were wrong by a wide margin. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally absurd facts about the original Star Trek, the production gambles, the real-life heroics hiding behind the uniforms, and the civil rights icon who personally talked one of its stars out of quitting. Let's get into it. Gene Roddenberry spent his career imagining a future where humanity reached beyond Earth. After his death in 1991, a piece of that future actually happened to him. In 1992, a small portion of Roddenberry's cremated remains flew aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia on mission STS-52, orbiting Earth for several days before returning home, essentially a proof of concept for what was coming next. In 1997, Roddenberry's ashes became part of one of the earliest commercial space burials, launched by the company Celestis aboard a Pegasus rocket alongside the remains of several other people, most notably 1960s counterculture figure Timothy Leary. That capsule orbited Earth for roughly 5 years before burning up on re-entry in 2002. The story didn't end there. Decades later, in January 2024, a memorial spaceflight named Enterprise Flight launched aboard United Launch Alliance's Vulcan Centaur rocket, carrying cremated remains and DNA samples from Roddenberry, his wife Majel Barrett Roddenberry, Nichelle Nichols, James Doohan, and DeForest Kelley into deep space, on a trajectory intended to leave Earth orbit permanently. A show built around exploring the final frontier ended up sending its own creators into it. Before Star Trek could boldly go anywhere, it nearly died in a boardroom. The original 1965 pilot, The Cage, tested poorly with NBC executives, who found it too cerebral and too slow. Pilots that get rejected almost never get a second chance. Studios cut their losses and move on. Star Trek was being produced by Desilu Productions, the studio co-founded by Lucille Ball and her ex-husband Desi Arnaz, with Ball serving as president after their divorce. According to accounts from people who worked at Desilu at the time, Ball overruled studio executives who wanted to drop the project and approved the unusual step of funding a second pilot, something virtually unheard of in the industry. That second pilot, where no man has gone before, is the one that ultimately sold NBC on ordering a full series. Without that decision, there is no 3-season run, no movies, no decades of spin-offs. The most successful science fiction franchise in television history exists, in no small part, because the star of I Love Lucy was willing to bet studio money on a show about a starship. In The Cage, the Enterprise's first officer wasn't Spock. It was a character known only as Number One, played by actress Majel Barrett, calm, logical, almost entirely unemotional, and clearly in command. NBC's response was lukewarm at best. Network feedback at the time reportedly suggested audiences wouldn't accept a stoic woman issuing orders to a male crew. Roddenberry didn't eliminate the character's traits, he redistributed them. Much of Number One's analytical detachment and cool authority was folded into the character of Spock for the reworked pilot, while Barrett stayed with the show in a different role, Nurse Christine Chapel, and later, the uncredited voice of the Federation's computer systems across multiple Star Trek series for decades. The first officer's personality didn't disappear from the bridge, it just changed species. The 1968 episode Plato's Stepchildren featured a kiss between Captain Kirk, William Shatner, and Lieutenant Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, widely cited as one of the first interracial kisses scripted for American television, airing the year after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down state bans on interracial marriage in Loving versus Virginia. NBC executives were anxious about backlash, particularly from affiliate stations in the South, and asked for an alternate take that avoided actual contact between the actors. Both Nichols and Shatner have described, in separate interviews over the years, deliberately making the safe, alternate takes unusable, flubbing lines, breaking character, mugging for the camera, until production ran out of time, and the only usable footage was the real kiss. When the episode aired, the backlash NBC feared never really materialized. Viewer mail was largely positive. It's one of the clearer examples in television history of a network underestimating its own audience. The hand gesture that goes with "live long and prosper" wasn't dreamed up in a production meeting. Leonard Nimoy, who was raised in an Orthodox Jewish household in Boston, has explained in interviews that the gesture came from a memory of attending synagogue as a child. During the priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, a ritual traditionally performed with the hand shaped to form the Hebrew letter Shin, the first letter in Shaddai, one of the names of God. Congregants are traditionally told not to look directly at the blessing, which is part of why the gesture stuck so vividly in young Nimoy's memory. He peaked when the production needed a distinctive Vulcan greeting for the Season 2 premiere Amok Time. Nimoy suggested the gesture, and director Joseph Pevney approved it. Nimoy later said one of the things that genuinely moved him was realizing fans around the world had no idea they were unknowingly recreating a centuries-old religious blessing every time they threw up the salute at a convention. Before James Doohan played Chief Engineer Montgomery Scotty Scott, he served as a lieutenant in the Canadian Army's 14th Field Artillery Regiment and landed on Juno Beach during the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. Doohan led his men through a minefield and helped clear out enemy machine gun positions that day. That night, while moving between positions, he was struck by a series of bullets fired by a nervous Canadian sentry who mistook him for the enemy. A textbook case of friendly fire. Doohan was hit multiple times, including a shot to the chest that was stopped by a metal cigarette case in his breast pocket, and a bullet that struck his right hand, ultimately costing him the middle finger. Doohan went on to act for decades, and on Star Trek, production made deliberate choices, camera angles, hand positioning, occasional use of a hand double for close-ups, to keep the missing finger from being noticeable on screen. Most viewers never spotted it, though it's visible in a few unguarded shots over the course of the series, including a brief moment in The Trouble with Tribbles. By late 1967, word spread that NBC was planning to cancel Star Trek after its second season. Organized largely by fan Bijo Trimble and her husband John, viewers launched one of television's earliest large-scale, grassroots letter-writing campaigns, encouraging fans to write NBC directly and to recruit others to do the same. NBC has stated it received well over 100,000 pieces of mail in response, and the network ultimately announced the show's renewal for a third season on air, reportedly one of the first times a network publicly responded to fan pressure in that way. Star Trek was still canceled after that third season due to ongoing low ratings, but the campaign demonstrated something the industry hadn't fully reckoned with yet. A small, passionate audience could generate enough noise to change a network's decision, decades before the internet made that kind of mobilization routine. That same fan energy later contributed to lobbying NASA to name its first space shuttle prototype Enterprise in 1976. The Trouble with Tribbles, one of the most beloved episodes of the original series, centers on small, furry, rapidly multiplying creatures that overrun the Enterprise. To create that illusion on a limited budget, the production built several hundred Tribble props out of synthetic fur and stuffing, some rigged with small mechanisms so they would appear to wriggle. Cast and crew members have described, in interviews and convention appearances over the years, finding stray Tribbles turning up in odd places on set for weeks after filming, wrapped, tucked into equipment cases, vents, and drawers, partly because crew members thought it was funny to keep hiding them in each other's belongings. The avalanche scene, where Kirk opens a storage compartment and is buried under a pile of Tribbles, reportedly took multiple takes to get right, since the crew dropping props from above couldn't always see exactly where Shatner was standing. Several surviving original Tribble props are now part of the collection at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Composer Alexander Courage wrote the iconic instrumental theme for Star Trek. His contract reportedly included a standard music industry clause. If lyrics were ever added to the music, the lyricist would be entitled to a share of performance royalties going forward. Roddenberry wrote lyrics for the theme, lyrics that were essentially never used on air and were, by most accounts including Courage's own, not particularly good. beyond the rim of the starlight/my love is wandering in starflight. But filing them was enough to legally establish Roddenberry as a co-writer of the song under the relevant performance rights framework, entitling him to roughly half of the royalties generated every time the theme aired, in any country, for the rest of the show's broadcast life, syndication, reruns, and beyond. Courage was reportedly furious about the arrangement, and it strained their professional relationship. He didn't return to score later seasons of the original series. Roddenberry's earliest concept for Spock gave him reddish skin to emphasize his alien heritage. Test footage reportedly showed that red makeup read poorly on black and white television sets still common in American households in the mid-1960s, rendering as a flat, muddy gray rather than anything otherworldly. Makeup artist Fred Phillips ultimately settled on a yellowish-green tint that read better on camera, and became the character's signature look once color broadcasts caught up. Separately, NBC executives were reportedly uneasy about Spock's pointed ears and angled eyebrows, worried the look skewed too sinister for a primetime network audience, and early publicity photos were retouched to soften his features, in some cases removing the ears entirely. Network anxiety aside, Spock became arguably the most popular character on the show. Martin Cooper, the Motorola engineer widely credited with inventing the first handheld mobile phone, he made the first public call on one in 1973, has said in multiple interviews that the flip-open communicator used by Kirk and the crew was part of what got him thinking about a genuinely portable phone, separate from car-mounted systems that existed at the time. Cooper has also clarified that his primary childhood inspiration was actually the two-way wrist radio from the Dick Tracy comic strip, but he's acknowledged that Star Trek served as a vivid, contemporary reference point that made the idea of a pocket-sized communication device feel achievable rather than purely fictional. Motorola leaned into the connection decades later with the 1996 StarTAC, a clamshell phone whose flip design was a fairly direct visual nod to the Enterprise communicator. For decades, a persistent rumor has claimed William Shatner wore a girdle under his Starfleet uniform to keep Captain Kirk looking trim on camera. Shatner has repeatedly and directly denied this in interviews over the years. The rumor likely persists partly because 1960s network television genuinely did put enormous pressure on leading men to look a certain way on camera, and partly because Kirk's appearance visibly shifted across the show's 3 production years, the unremarkable, ordinary result of an actor aging during a physically demanding shooting schedule. One offhand assumption snowballed over decades into something many fans now repeat as settled fact, despite Shatner's consistent denials. A throwaway reference in early behind-the-scenes material placed Captain Kirk's hometown in a small town in Iowa. In 1985, the town of Riverside, Iowa, formally voted to declare itself the official future birthplace of James T. Kirk, with Roddenberry's blessing, turning an offhand detail into a real-world tourist destination. The town built a small Star Trek museum, installed a marker noting the spot where Kirk will supposedly be born, and has hosted an annual fan festival called TrekFest every June since, drawing original cast members like William Shatner and George Takei over the years. The 2009 Star Trek film reboot, directed by J.J. Abrams, went on to depict Kirk's birth in Iowa on screen, effectively making Riverside's "Beam me up, Scotty" was never actually said on the showcase's old claim part of official franchise canon. It's one of the most quoted lines in pop culture, printed on merchandise for decades, and it does not appear, in that exact phrasing, in any of the 79 original episodes. Kirk says variations like "beam us up, Scotty," or simply "beam me up." But the precise four-word phrase as commonly remembered was never spoken on screen during the original series. The phrase became so embedded in popular culture that James Doohan himself eventually leaned into it, titling his 1996 autobiography "Beam Me Up, Scotty." By that point, correcting the record was beside the point. The phrase had become bigger than the dialogue it was supposedly quoting. After Star Trek's first season, Nichelle Nichols, who played Communications Officer Lieutenant Uhura, had decided to leave the show to pursue a career on Broadway, and told Roddenberry she planned to resign. According to Nichols' own account, repeated in interviews over the years, including a 2011 conversation with NPR, Roddenberry asked her to take the weekend to think it over before finalizing her decision. That same weekend, Nichols attended an NAACP fundraising event in Los Angeles, where she was told someone wanted to meet her, describing himself as her biggest fan. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached and told her he was a genuine admirer of the show, revealing that Star Trek was one of the only programs he and his wife Coretta Scott King allowed their children to stay up and watch. When Nichols mentioned she was planning to leave, King stopped her and explained the significance of what her presence on the bridge represented, that for the first time, black audiences were being shown on television exactly as they should be seen, intelligent, capable, and treated as equals. Nichols returned to Roddenberry the following Monday and withdrew her resignation. She stayed with the role for the remainder of the original series, reprised it across the animated series and 6 feature films, and went on to actively recruit for NASA in the 1970s and 1980s, a campaign credited with bringing in some of the first women and black astronauts to the agency, including Sally Ride, Guyon Bluford, and Mae Jemison, who has spoken about Nichols' influence on her own path to space. One conversation at a fundraiser kept a character on the air who would go on to influence real spaceflight for decades afterward. From a comedian who bet her own studio's money on a science fiction pilot nobody believed in, to a war hero hiding a missing finger on camera, to a civil rights leader who saw something in a fictional starship that he wanted for the real world, Star Trek was held together by far stranger and more human stories than most of what ended up on screen. Which one of these surprised you the most? Let us know down in the comments, and we'll see you on the next mission.